um, I don't think Senator Flexer is going to make it again. She's had rotten luck with the scheduling. These seem
Okay.
to be coincide with her GAE committee
Okay.
meetings. She might be here briefly.
Okay.
We'll get started.
Yeah, well, Representative Pablo Octomato has joined us, as has Representative Nolan.
Great. Okay. So I think that, well, first off, thank you for making yourselves available to us today. Hopefully we'll have better luck than we're talking, so it's better luck than last time, where technical difficulties really sort of derailed our working meeting. I think that what we're going to do today is go over answers to questions that were asked in the larger public hearing. I have, but I think from Sue, um, an answer. I think it's a 5-page document from UConn Health Center, and a much larger, longer, 34 pages from UConn, dated March 10th. Is that the accurate answers? Is that the plan? Is that? I just want to make sure that that's current. I think that March 10th might have been when we originally were scheduled for. Does that sound right to people?
Yes.
We believe so, Representative.
Okay. So given that one is 5 pages and the other is 34 pages, why don't we start through the 5-page one first, unless you guys have other thoughts about it. I mean, we have an hour and a half. It seems like we could go through relatively quickly. I don't know if we will have the good fortune of having President Katsilas with us for the entire meeting. So I will allow, I know if you had any initial comments that you wanted to make, if you can stay with us for the entire meeting, that would be helpful as well, I suppose. But I'll leave that up to you. You've got a very capable team in front of you.
I certainly do. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having us back, and appreciate your interest in getting at these details and facts, and all of your support. It means so much to us. As you alluded to, I have a very capable team. If I may, I'd like to just introduce them here. We have Scott Jordan, our Executive Vice President for Administration and Chief Financial Officer. We have Andy Aguinobi, our CEO and Executive Vice President for Health Affairs. He has with him Jeff Gagan, the CFO for the health system. We have Nathan First, our Vice President for Enrollment Planning and Management. And we have our crack government relations team, Gail Garber, Joanne Lombardo. I see we also have the Chief of Staff of the health system, Andrea Kelty. And looking on to page 2 here to see if I missed anyone. I think we have some additional support team here for facts and figures. If the rest of us don't have them, but thank you at the very highest level. Just to say, your public flagship university is thriving, Representative Haddad. We have fared remarkably well through the pandemic, both in terms of health and now in terms of one-time funding to get through the one-time losses. And our focus is now shifting towards the state ongoing block grant and maintaining sea level so that we can be strong for the state in the recovery period to come. I think I covered some of this stuff before, and I'm more than happy to, presidents with their president hat love to brag about their institution, and there's so much I could brag about this team and this university and how well it's fared through this most challenging year in its history. I couldn't be more proud, and I think the state has been a great partner in this, and can be very proud of its public flagship university, which has really moved forward in a down year relative to public flagships across the country in almost every metric, and so it's been remarkable. And we've managed to keep our students and our constituency safe. The positivity rate among students has remained consistently lower than the state as a whole, somewhere around 1% overall. And gratefully, we have not seen any transmission from students to faculty, staff, or surrounding communities. So that's the most important thing. And UConn Health continues to save hundreds of lives from COVID, and as well as provide full service healthcare that it's so known for. So with that, I can stay and answer perhaps your first question, which was about federal funding, and then probably the rest of them I'll hand off to the rest of the team.
Okay.
Do you have any questions though, before we dive?
Well, I do think I'd like to see if we can just work through your responses. I mean, 34 pages is versus 5 pages. I just thought we'd start with the health center, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
I would just make two quick comments. One is, you know, I live in stores, of course, and you know, this past weekend was one of those extraordinary weekends. The weather was great.
Yes.
Students were out. But one of the really nice things is that this was their annual sort of Husky-thon fundraising drive. And even amidst a pandemic, that your students could collectively raise over $1 million for the Connecticut Children's Medical Center, I think is really remarkable. It speaks to the spirit of the student body here at UConn. They seem to be surviving pretty well through the COVID pandemic. I know that that's down from past years, which I think is probably attributable to the pandemic, but we saw students everywhere doing what they do best in one of the signature service events of the year, and I just wanted to compliment them on that. I would also just mention one other thing, that since our first meeting was canceled due to the technical issues, and now we have had the opportunity to meet with the state university system and the community college system, and they didn't take quite all the money. There's some left over that we can talk about today. I think we have $15.27. And we'll let you divvy that up between UConn and UConn Health, but talk about that as we move forward. If you the first questions on the health center's responses were about COVID. I will tell you that when I'm looking at this, the type is exceedingly small, and so
yes.
You'll just have to bear with me. And if we could go relatively expeditiously through the 5 questions, that we can see if members have any questions about the UConn Health Center, and then we'll move on to
So we'll be brief. Thank you, everyone. I'm Andy Aguinobi, CEO of UConn Health and the EVP of Health Affairs. First of all, we'll take the $15 and Tom will take the 27 cents. So I think we already agreed on that. Yeah, so look, I'm equally proud of everything that UConn Health is doing. And I want to say thank you to all the legislators, because we could not do it without you. We couldn't be providing sort of 37% of the School of Medicine graduates, staying in the state, or 47% of the School of Dental Medicine graduates staying in the state, or the amazing COVID-19 response, the financial strength that we're seeing in UConn Health, if not for the unfunded legacy costs. But let me just go straight to the questions. And so the first one is, provide detail on COVID-19 related federal funds received to date. And it's about 17 million for fiscal year 20 and the same for 21. But I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Gagan, our Chief Financial Officer, to give more detail. Are you
Great.
on?
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. So the first 2 pages of the 5 pages for UConn Health are just the summary of the federal funding that is related to COVID. Of the total, we did break out into columns: fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21, and then the far right column is a total of both of those years. So cash received for both years is approximately 36 million. And of that, we have about 18.1 million was in fiscal 20 and about 18.7 we have here in fiscal year 21. The majority of those funds actually came through the federal side. It's in the first row, which is the Provider Relief Fund through the CARES Act for the hospital and the physician practice. This fund is run by HHS. They had allocations in different tranches on how they were giving out the funds. So we applied for every single one we could. And then we had some just blanket authorizations, and then we had some hotspot authorizations on how they gave out the funds during both years. But you see in fiscal year 20, it was 17.1 million. And then this year in fiscal year 21, we received about 15.7. The only other thing of major note I would like to point out, if you go down on the first page towards the bottom, we have applied for both FEMA on the federal side and the Corona Relief Fund on the state side for reimbursement of direct expenses related to the pandemic. At this point in time, we're still waiting for the final approval on FEMA for our allocation. We applied through the state like all other state entities. That package is with the feds, and they have reviewed that and gotten back questions, which we are now answering for them. So, but the combination, we are still have $12 million in that application process, but we haven't received any cash to date. But we do hope, hopefully in the next couple of months, to start receive cash for both the FEMA side, and then the balance of anything would really go back to the Corona Relief Fund we have from the state. But those are the majority, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's any questions on the first two pages.
Yeah, if I could just add just a couple of context before we take questions. One is just to note that last year, so fiscal year 20, the 17 million was applied to the COVID-19 losses that we had, and those losses were over $30 million. And so we ended up with a COVID-19 related loss of 18.9 million for fiscal year 20. And then the 15 million that we have for fiscal year 21 was applied to COVID related losses of 61 million. The remainder of that we managed internally through furloughs and expense reductions and revenues and etc. So that we sort of eliminated the COVID related losses in fiscal year 21, which only so that what remained is the 53.8 million in unfunded legacy costs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is important, and it's hard to, there's a lot of relief money coming to the state, and our ability to sort of make sure that we're also addressing the losses and revenue that you've experienced, I think is, or just understand the losses and revenue, I think is important. So fiscal year 2020, I think you tell me the figure again for the total loss.
Yeah, so the total loss was, Jeff, you want to see what was it? Was it originally, well, the total loss now that we have is, that we submitted is 18.9 million.
That's what's left over after receiving.
Yes, that's what's left over after receiving the funds.
Yeah, right. And
if there's no questions, if there are questions, we're happy to take them, but we can move on to the second question when you're ready.
Yeah. I haven't turned on my participant list there to see if anybody's got their hand up, but now that I don't see anybody's hand up. But if anybody has a question, now would be the time to ask it about COVID relief funds. If not, let's move on then.
Okay. So the second question, again, which Jeff will take, is provide FTE breakdown by fund source.
So on this one, we actually just broke down, we took one of the latest payrolls, which was January 14th of 21. And we broke it out between our general fund and then our other funds, which is really made up of tuition, research, and clinical revenues. So those other revenue sources are what the other fund is for UConn Health. You can see though in this particular chart there that the classified, the faculty, and then all other staff, a little over 1,300 members currently are on the general fund. So that's out of the total of 4,485, or approximately 30% currently. So 70% are covered by all of those other revenue generating activities for UConn Health. But we did note, though, this is a little unique in the current year just because of the way the general fund was allocated to UConn Health. We received more funds in the beginning of the year than we will at the end of the year, just for a cash flow. But normally that number really covered by the general fund is approximately 1,700, or about 37% of our employees on a more normalized year would be on the general fund. But with that, again, the additional 63% is still from those other funds. So the majority is really the clinical operations, which cover the funding for those faculty and staff positions. So the only other aspect, really, we did put down, somebody asked the total vacant positions. So currently we have 292, which over almost 60% of those are clinical related. And our vacant positions at UConn Health, we actually budget by position control. So every employee has their employee number, but every position has its own number. So when those positions are vacated throughout the year, we actually review the position before it is reposted. So anything that can be removed has already been removed from this number, and we only post the positions that are needed. And again, the majority of these are for clinical care in the aspect of the hospital and the physician practice. And then as we move forward and look at all of the positions that we have, there's a committee that reviews all of these on a bi-weekly basis every time a position is vacated. And just for knowledge, about 10% is a turnover rate for the clinical side that we normally see. So that would lead us to, on a normal basis, anywhere between 350 up to 400 positions are really expected at any given time. So the 292 is actually a little lower at this point in time than our normal run rate that we've seen.
Right.
So with that, I would turn it back over to see if there's any questions on the position or the funding breakout.
Yeah, just so the 292 positions, if they were to be filled, they would be filled entirely through your own revenues, right? It doesn't have, our block grant is not linked to your position count in that respect. Our block grant is somewhat arbitrary. We provide it to you to fund, you use it to fund as many positions as possible. Any additional positions or hires that you make, you would do out of your own resources, right?
Correct, absolutely correct. And as I said, on the clinical side, it's even kind of misleading sometimes. Even though we have a vacant position, we are paying either temp staff, traveler staff, or overtime because that is still needed. So we're still paying for that while we're recruiting to try to get a permanent full-time position in.
I see Representative Nolan's hand is up. Representative Nolan, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And you actually stole my question, but I wanted to follow up. One on the fact that there's that many positions vacant. Is there a list that you can send us to show us what the positions are exactly? And two, what are we finding it? Why is it so difficult to keep those positions filled, so that we can have an understanding of why there's so many vacancies? And the temp staff, are they paid? What rate are the temp staff paid at to keep them temp staff versus full time?
Yeah, so number one, we can definitely get you that list of the current vacancies. That's no problem. Number two, really that this rate of vacancy is really expected, especially driven by the clinical aspect. We've mentioned it a lot of times. We're in a competitive market. There is 6 other hospitals really within 20 miles of us, and they're all trying to get the best talent they can. So a lot of these are nurses, these are medical assistants and staff in the clinical areas that are being recruited everywhere else in the Hartford region also. So It's not an outlier for us at all to have, this type of vacancy that we've actually had.
Okay.
And we can definitely, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
And when you say competitive, what are we doing to keep people in position versus having to worry about them leaving for other places?
And I'll actually let Dr. Aguinobi also answer, but that is a constant human resource initiative that we do have. Besides the environment and our facilities that we actually have, up to date, current, and everything else, it is training, education, and bringing on a lot of different things to make sure that we are the employer of choice, basically, for our region. But I'll let Dr. Aguinobi also answer.
I think you've said it. It's the same. We face the same issues that I think any organization faces, where you want to make sure that people are satisfied, they're happy. There's a lot of, by the way, there's a lot of pride. I would say we've done engagement surveys, and it's always moving in the right direction. I would say that there's a lot of pride, but it is a competitive environment. So sometimes it boils down to looking at, are they giving sign-in bonuses elsewhere that we should be looking at? Are we from a market standpoint, are we at the right place? But a lot of people come to academia not just for the work, they come here for the research, they come here for the teaching. So making sure that they're feeling fulfilled in that regards as well. So there's really no one answer. It's just really, we do it individually. So for example, if a person is looking to exit the organization, we, to the extent that they give us a chance, we talk to them about what is it that's making you want to leave. And we also do exit interviews as well to see if we can resolve it for others. So it's just a very multifactorial.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, if I can ask another question.
Go ahead.
Could you explain the temp staff? What is so good about being a temp staff versus a full-time staff that those temp staff are not committing to that full-time?
And then I would say the answer is the temp staff are really travelers. They're outside agencies that come in. So they're more than welcome to apply for that position. But if we have a nursing vacancy for, let's say, one of our ORs, we bring an outside person in so we can continue to have all the scheduled procedures we have until that position is actually filled. So it is, again, it's part of the actual operations. All health systems face this, but it is, and it's a more expensive. So we always do look to fill those as quickly as possible and use less temp staff than
a good example. A good example of this is our operating rooms. So everybody needs, all hospitals around need a full complement of operating room nurses and staff. And they're very hard to find because the amount of training, you might have to train a nurse for a year before they can actually be on their own in the operating room assisting. And so you can imagine there's a shortage of nursing, operating room nurses. Every hospital has operating rooms. So sometimes it's about money, where the best salary is. Sometimes it's about schedules. Can I get a better schedule in another hospital than this hospital? But no matter what the case is, and by the way, we've had a lot of success recently in hiring operating room nurses because we are constantly trying to address the issues. But if there are 3 out, we need to fill those 3 with temporary staff so that the operations can be done. And there are nurses that's all they do. All they do is contract work. And we bring them in, but as soon as we can, and they're sometimes quite expensive, but as soon as we can replace them, we do that and they move on to another job in another hospital. So it's pretty complex. Yeah, but it's a great question.
It seems like what we offer them to be temp staff is very, I guess, lucrative to them versus the full-time position. So I don't know what we can do to try and fix that.
Yes, these are great points, Representative, and it's something that we deal with all the time. No one wants to use temp staff if they can avoid it, because not only are they usually more expensive, but they also don't know your policies quite as well as someone that's been here for a long, long time. So we certainly don't sort of prefer temp staff. This is not like, you know, some organizations that prefer staff to be temp. We prefer them to be our employees, but sometimes it's just very difficult to find full-time staff, and you have to see the patients.
And I can let you know, one of the things we've actually started in the past 5 years is really the relationship with the main campus. So the nursing school, we actually do education and training here. And then part of that is we have open positions to bring the nurses from the education and training into a first year nursing position to then further their training to be an OR nurse or an ICU nurse. So as we started that, those positions and that relationship has grown stronger, especially over the last 5 years. So we're trying to internally create those jobs and those positions from the main campus over to the health center also.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for those answers. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Nolan. Are there any additional questions about staffing? The next question is
yes,
bottom line question, I guess.
Yeah, bottom line question. What exactly are the funds you're requesting for fiscal year 20 to 23? And if you look at that chart, and I'm going to hand it to Jeff in a second, but it really all stems from the second row, which is the unfunded legacy costs that you see fiscal year 21, 22, and 23. So it's 53.8 million in 21, 58.7 million in 22, and 60.7 million in 23. And we actually demonstrated from our financials that in fiscal year 19, we were on track to actually have a positive margin because we had some funding for the unfunded legacy costs, not the full amount, and because we've grown our revenues and held our costs in check. So if we got this funding for the unfunded legacy cost, we would be in a good place financially. We still have to do other work, but we would be in a relatively good place. But so what we have is for fiscal year 21, the governor in his budget put 50 million. But that has to also cover the $18.9 million loss that you can see in the first column under the governor's budget proposal, the first row, COVID revenue losses and deficiency, 18.9 million for fiscal year 20. So the 50 million that's in the governor's budget has to cover that. And what's left over is 31.1 million to be applied to the 53.8 million in unfunded legacy costs for fiscal year 21. What that leaves is, if you go all the way down to the bottom, that leaves a gap of 22.7 million. So we're requesting that 22.7 million in addition to the governor's, what's in the governor's budget. And then if you go into fiscal year 22, you can see under the governor's budget proposal, second row, unfunded legacy cost, the governor has proposed 40 million, which again is short of the unfunded legacy cost for fiscal year 22. Again, going up to the second row is 58.7 million. So that 40 million is very welcome, but it will leave a shortfall, if you go down to the bottom there, of 18.7 million. And then there's nothing appropriated, nothing in the governor's budget for fiscal year 23. So that leaves a big hole of 70.5 million in fiscal year 23. So so that's the requests are sort of at the bottom there, 22.7 for this year, 18.7 for next year, and 70.5 for the third year. Now I'm going to pause here and ask Jeff to make sure that I got that right and see if there's anything he wants to add to that.
Yeah, no, the only thing I would just point out for clarification. So the fiscal 20 and 21 is the governor's deficiency proposal. So in his proposal, he proposed $50 million. So we are requesting an additional 22.7. So the total deficiency request is $72 million. So we would need the governor's plus the 22. And then for the biennium budget, or the next two fiscal years, it is, as Dr. Aguinobi just mentioned, the governor did propose an additional amount of $40 million in fiscal 22, but there was zero additional funding in 23. So that's why we have an 18 million additional ask in 22, but it jumps up to 70.5 in 23.
Right, and just as a point of clarification, I just want to say one of the things that's interesting about the unfunded legacy costs, and just to be sure that we all recognize this, if I guess I'll make the point just by being overly dramatic. If we were to close the UConn Health Center immediately and it all would go away, the legacy costs are still left with the state, right? And likewise, if it were to be, sold or privatized, the legacy costs would then shift. Presumably, those are unfunded legacy costs would also shift to the state, right? Yeah.
Correct.
So the rationale that you're making, I guess, is that the legacy costs, and I think there's some justification of this. The legacy costs really aren't yours. What we do in state government, in higher education, with some agencies that have a substantial amount of their own revenue sources, is we essentially ask you to shoulder part of the burden of unfunded legacy costs through your own revenues. And so there's a dollar amount that you pay to the comptroller's office that goes to pay for unfunded pension costs. That really is not related to what might have been incurred by your own employees. I mean, certainly, your employees are state employees. They're just like all other employees. But for all other state agencies, those costs are paid for out of the state comptroller's office. But because you have a substantial revenue source, so do through tuition dollars, the state universities and the community colleges, and the state university flagship has its own revenue sources. We essentially ask that you take part of your revenues and apply them to the unfunded pension legacy costs for the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, that's better said than I think any of us could say it. How it works in practice is quite simple, and that is that it just comes from our operations. When we're hiring someone that's not on the general fund, we're paying a 70% on average benefit rate because of that amount that is buried into their benefits. And most organizations wouldn't be able to survive with that. When you compare 70% versus 26% or 28%. And so that's a real weight on our operations. At the end of the day, sort of the way you said it is, if we can't fund it because it's too much for us, we come back to the state, and we ask for it. So it's sort of a little bit, as you said, it's really a state responsibility.
Right. Representative Pavlak D'Amato has her hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if you could be specific, a little more specific. I'm on page 13 where there are some asterisks and it defines a couple of these fund types, but I was wondering specifically what consists of unfunded legacy costs. I guess I'm a little unclear as to what that is.
That's great. Jeff, do you want to handle that?
Sure. So the unfunded legacy costs, as we actually define it, are costs that are actually built into the retirement rate that the comptroller charges for all employees on the pension plan or the SERS plan from the state. So the way that it works is every year the comptroller develops rates, and then those rates are applied to payroll. So next year, it is projected that it could be 68% is going to be charged to an employee on the SERS retirement plan. Or for every dollar of salary, the entity, for us, UConn Health or stores, has to pay 68 cents additional to the comptroller to cover the costs. Now, the retirement rate has built in a lot of different factors in it. Some of it is for the current employee and some of it is for current expenses, but the majority of the cost that's left is for employees that have already retired. So some of the rates that they're building in are for these payments that they need to make to employees that have nothing to do with the current employee or even the current allocation for the entity, but it's the employees that have already retired and receiving the retirement benefits and the health benefits. So that unfunded portion is just a way to move cash to make those payments each fiscal year as they're needed.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, would it be helpful if we pulled up a slide for the committee to see what Jeff is referring
to? That's fine. I know we've been trying to get through the health centers or responses, but I know that there was something in the submission for the stores campus.
Yes.
It might be on page 13. I don't know if that's what Representative Pavlak-D'Amato is looking at, but I didn't print out page numbers, but there is a slide, I think, that begins to separate out that with 64% on this slide. But do you guys have the ability to share that?
Yeah, Kelly, can you share that Fringe slide?
That might be helpful, I think, for the committee to understand. But we won't go over this, Graham, when we get to UConn stores again.
That's it.
There we go. That's it.
And I think, Jeff, as you're explaining this, or whether Scott's going to explain it, I'm not sure. I think the context is that we're talking about the reason why this occurs the way it does is because of the unfunded liability at the state level, essentially being allocated out to active state employees in order to bridge that, or to help bridge that unfunded liability. So it's more historically retired people. But who wants to take this? Is it Scott or is it?
Sure. Yeah. Andy, I'm happy to do that. So as Jeff was explaining, the state comptroller charges all state agencies, and in our case, UConn Health, CCSU system, CSCU system, and also Bradley Airport and some other similar state agencies. We're charged a fringe benefit rate for every employee that we have, and for any employee, and UConn employees are state employees. Any state employee that elects to participate in the state pension system, we are charged a 64% of charge for that employee. And you can see on the left side of this table the breakdown of the state fringe benefit rates. That 64 percentage points, 39, and these are the actual rates for fiscal 21. Of that 64%, 39.5% roughly is for unfunded pension liability. 21% is for retiree health. So these are charges for unfunded obligations that the state has to retirees that have little to do with current employees, as has been said already several times. These are charges based on decisions that the state made years ago to not fund the state pension or pre-fund retiree health care. Important to note, and there's nothing in our testimony today that is critical of this. The reason that this is happening now is because the state legislature and governor over the better part of the last decade has chosen to meet these obligations and to fund these unfunded liabilities, and are allocating these costs to all state agencies. The reason that this is an issue for UConn Health, CCSU, and the airport is because we are competitive. We compete in the market for students, for clinicians, for patients, and these charges are non-competitive. We are, when we hire a faculty member, or we hire a doctor or a nurse, as we were talking about earlier, we need to compete for folks to come work for us. If for every dollar that we pay in salary, we need to pay another 64% just for their retirement. You can see the rest of this slide here breaks out the other, what you'd think of as normal fringe benefit costs for health insurance, et cetera. We have employees at UConn and UConn Health who, for every dollar we pay a dollar or more into the state fringe benefit system. It puts us at a competitive disadvantage. So our ask, and I know we testified separately at a hearing on a bill that would solve this, last week, our ask is that just the unfunded pension liability and unfunded healthcare liability be borne by the state comptroller rather than pushed onto UConn and UConn Health.
Representative Pavlak-D'Amato, did you have any follow-up questions before I move on to, I see Senator Austin has her hand up.
Yeah, just that, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but so nurses, when they're going in and interviewing are, I mean, of course, they're asking about health benefits and salary, but they're going into the details and asking about the details of the retirement fund and what that consists of in interviews.
When we hire a person, they're allowed to choose their health insurance and they are allowed to choose whether to participate in the state pension. And the competitiveness issue for us is one of, if any dollar that we're paying of our budget to pay for unfunded pension liability, that's a dollar that we can't pay to hire a person in salary. So that is, that it affects our overall budget. It affects our ability to post jobs. And you'll see less of this at UConn Health, but at stores when you see our vacancies, we take our time in hiring because we are always trying to trim the budget to help pay for these costs, and that does result, honestly, in a smaller, less competitive university. And especially you'll see that on the research side.
Okay, so then just one more follow-up. So then would you say right now, as far as salary, that what you're able to offer is not as competitive as other, other hospitals or traveling nurses, whatever the case may be?
We are able to offer competitive. We have to offer competitive salaries because nobody will come if the hospital down the road is paying $10,000 more than we are. So we've mapped our salaries and we see that we're well within the range most of the time. Now sometimes we fall behind. we have to update it. But the challenge is really the cost of hiring. So we might hire, just roughly, we might hire 2 nurses where another hospital for the same amount can hire 3. Or if we hire 3, we're paying a third more than they are because of this. So it's really about the cost overall, including the retirement part. Does that make sense, Representative?
Yes, it does. I think I would like to see it, and I don't know if you can get the information, but just when maybe a comparison, and maybe there's an outside group that does that, so I can see, in comparison to salary offerings, but also healthcare, and then retirement as well. So how they match up to other other hospitals. I think that would be a little more useful.
Absolutely, we have that, and one of the things I would say because sometimes I know no one here has that issue, but a lot of times when we're talking sort of in the press or something like that about this issue, unfunded legacy costs, people think that those are the benefits that these employees are receiving. They're not receiving those benefits. They're receiving pretty regular standard state employee benefits when they go for health insurance, when they go for healthcare or whatever they might go for. It's simply a mechanism to send that money to the comptroller as we put it in there. And that's why it looks so huge in terms of the benefits. But we will absolutely share that the market, the data we have on salaries, how we compare, and any other information you would like.
Thank you.
Senator Austin.
So thank you very much. And I apologize for not being on earlier. I've been voting in 2 different committees. So as we all are nowadays. So I want to talk a little bit about the unfunded pension liability, which has been a continued problem for a while. And I would just point out that this unfunded pension liability is only going to go up, and not because the cost is going up, but quite frankly, the number of employees is going down. And when you divide the unfunded pension liability by the number of employees, that's how you come up with this 39.58%. And you have about 5,000 in the UConn Health environment, when I've looked at some of the numbers, about 5,000 less employees, generally speaking. Some of them may not be in this calculation because they may not be eligible for a pension. So I just want to point out to people that when they look at these numbers, that these numbers aren't because the unfunded pension liability continues to rise. Quite frankly, we have that under control. But what we have done is we are now down to the 1950s level of state employment, largely, of which UConn is a portion thereof. And as we continue to drop the number of employees down that we have, the unfunded pension liability per employee goes up. So I don't really need either UConn or UConn Health to respond to that, but for the record, those numbers are only going to go up because we keep dropping the number of employees down. If you looked on this chart right here, where it says normal or current retiree costs, those are below what other industries are reflective of. That is reflective of a tier 3 or tier 4 employee. And currently a tier 3 or tier 4 employee is essentially paying their whole retirement cost right there. So I want to point that out because people are looking at the top pink level and saying, what are we going to do about this pink level? What we're going to do is, and by the way, we could switch every employee into a 401k, which we already have for tier 4 employees. That still does not get rid of that unfunded pension liability, nor does it make us competitive relative to people coming in if we give them less post-employment benefits relative to healthcare or relative to pensions. Most places are paying higher than that relative to a 401k, and most are giving a fairly an even more robust healthcare cost because our healthcare costs have reflectively gone down $100 million. We're actually paying $100 million less in salary costs globally in this than we were a decade ago. So I want people to understand the unfunded pension liability is going to go up until we pay down that 80 years of not paying down the pension liability. And I thought that the response to, I don't know if it was UConn Health or UConn that responded to this, but the difference when someone is being hired is they have a choice of the SERS state plan, of which only 65% of UConn and UConn Health members are, but they could also choose ARP. And ARP, when the economy crashed and Wall Street crashed in the 2008-2009 timeframe, many of the employees of UConn and UConn Health and some of our other community colleges and state universities transferred from ARP over to SERS because they lost all their retirement funds in that time frame around 2008, 2009, 2010. And in an agreement, we're all given an opportunity to switch over to SERS. So we actually have more people in the SERS plan now from the number of employees there. Still not enough to drive down the cost of the unfunded pension liability. So as I've talked about this ad nauseum with people, I just have to say for the record, the unfunded pension liability is under control. Under Governor Malloy and under Governor Lamont, they would not sign a budget that did not include us continuing to pay down on the unfunded pension liability. In this current budget, the governor extends it out another 2 years or 3 years as allowable. However, it does not stop us from paying what the actuarials have determined to be the cost of the pension. And I agree that this does not allow us to be competitive, but I do believe that we have to understand the whole concept of the unfunded pension liability. And the fact is that until we pay off what many people before us, Democrat, Republican, those that consider themselves unaffiliated or independent by party did not do us any favor when they did not pay off the unfunded pension liability. And seeing as we are on being recorded and on YouTube, each time the unfunded pension liability comes up, I will go through this simple dissertation, which says that until we pay that down, we will have this problem across state agencies. And even all of the federal dollars come in, specifically call out that pension plans cannot be paid out of the either the American Rescue Plan or any other previous COVID ESSER funds or any of the other funds that are available. So I just want you to know that this is something that is under control. It still doesn't create the effect that we want because we will continue to have this until it is paid off. And I think it's 2046 when it's paid off. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Austin. We appreciate your advocacy on the issue. I especially, I mean, I've been, as you know, been very concerned about the impact that the unfunded accrued liability has had on tuition payers at the universities, colleges, and our state universities, and also on clinical patients at the hospital. And so, you know, it's those additional sources of funds that have been helping to shoulder part of the payments for the accrued liability for the entire state. And so I often use the analogy that a student whose parents have decided to send them to UConn, they pay their taxes, and a fair amount of their taxes are currently going towards paying off old debts or unfunded pension liabilities. But when they get to UConn and they pay their tuition, they're paying a higher tuition there too. They're paying again to pay off unfunded pension liability. You know, a payment that they would not have, they wouldn't incur if they were going to, you know, out of state or to a private university. And so it seems to me like we try to get them, and then we get them again and again as they pay fees and tuition to other parts of state government. The other point that I'd like to make around this is that while I agree with Senator Austin entirely that as the number of the state employees decreases, the rate increases, right? Because we're dividing the total pension obligation over fewer employees. But it's probably also true, and I don't know if anybody at UConn can comment on this, that the decreases in state employees in higher education, I suspect have been fewer as a percentage of the overall, if at all. I mean, the number of fewer state employees is less there than in other parts of government. And so since higher education is really the most substantial other part of government that pays its own liability costs, you're paying an increased share of the debt because your portion, the overall portion that higher education employees make up of the overall state employee pool is larger than it's ever been, I suspect, given the relative reductions in state employees in most of state government as opposed to specifically in higher education. Do you have any comments about that cost shift in terms of the overall percentage of the employees that are employed through higher education as opposed to the rest of state government?
Sure, Representative. I think your intuition is spot on. Remember that UConn has actually grown substantially over the last decade in enrollment. We are, I don't have the number right in front of me, but I know that our enrollment is up more than 2,000 undergraduate students since the beginning of the Next Gen program, which started, I want to believe, in 2014. Enrollment at our regional campuses is also up, and you know, as the university grows, we've not substantially grown our FTE count. In fact, we've got one of the leanest administrations amongst our peers, but we have not shrunk at the same rate as the rest of state government. So our share of total state employment has increased, and combining your comments with Senator Austin's comments, we do have some slides in our deck that show that this thing we're talking about, the share of the fringe rate that is attributable to unfunded pension liability, has skyrocketed for UConn over the last several years, even as the unfunded pension liability itself is, as Senator Austin said, is managed and pretty much a fixed cost for the state at this time.
We're technically still on UConn Health Center's time, but I think that we're probably done with that. And I didn't know if, Scott, if you wanted to lead us through a couple of the responses that you have here. And when we get to, if you wanted to show us a slide or two about the historical impact of unfunded pension liability, if you wanted to do that as you go through your responses, that would be fine. But I do want to I don't see anybody else's hands up. So why don't you go ahead and go through the response that you provided for question 1 for the work session.
I'm sure, I'm happy to do that. And I will note that we did send a package to you and to the committee that is 35 pages long, as you noted, Representative, but only the first 3 answer the questions that were asked during the appropriations hearing.
That's my error. As I started paging through, I skipped over. I got to page 4 and I said, "Oh, this is President Cancelaus's testimony."
It's fine, because we've actually been talking about the other 20 pages, which is mostly about Fringe. So as we've already discussed, this is the biggest policy issue that's on our minds at UConn and UConn Health over the coming biennium, and we very much appreciate yours and Senator Austin's and support and help in trying to understand this issue and help in working creatively with us to mitigate it. So thank you very much for that. The first question that was asked of UConn was to please provide detail on COVID-19 related federal funds received to date. And I'll comment before I read through the numbers that UConn has experienced over $100 million in COVID impact to date in lost revenue and direct expenses. That's at stores and regional campuses. I know there's also substantial impacts at UConn Health. We've received to date in fiscal 20 from the federal government $10.8 million in relief. In fiscal 20, we also issued $30 million in housing and dining refunds as we closed down campus operations, residential operations in March of last year, about a year ago. So we were reimbursed about 1/3 of that from the feds. In fiscal 21, we've received to date $14 million in direct reimbursement for expenditures that we've made, and another $42.4 million in general support from the CARES Act, from both versions of the CARES Act to date, totaling $56.7 million of federal aid in fiscal 21. We have also, of that, $20 million was from state resources that OPM allocated to offset some of our fiscal impacts. And we are still expecting from the American Rescue Plan additional support. And we've not received yet. It'll be over $20 million. We have not yet received official word from Department of Education how much that would be. But to date, we've had $108.9 million in impact, and we've received $67.6 million of federal aid, leaving us with $41 million of impact that has not been mitigated by federal or state assistance so far. The second question.
Just want to check to see if there's any of the members have questions about that rundown. Go ahead.
And I'll also note, and this is all in the table that was provided, and what I did not cover was that the federal government is also providing aid straight to our students. UConn is a pass-through for that aid. They allocate it through the same mechanism by which they provide financial aid to students. But the rules are that UConn needs to give that away to students. We are not allowed to use it to offset any of our expenses. And so far, we received $10.8 million in student aid last year and $10.9 million so far this year, with another allocation expected as part of the American Rescue Plan.
And just to be clear, you can't use that to supplant any financial aid that you had promised or will promise to a student.
No.
Right?
And
So this is really intended to be, I mean, it's direct assistance. It's really non-educational related. If you're a student at a university that receives these pass-through dollars, you benefit from them, but it's intended to help those students with whatever economic pressures they're feeling through the COVID crisis.
That's right. That's our understanding, Representative. And we do have our Vice President of Enrollment, Nathan First, on if there are any more detailed questions on how the federal aid's being administered.
I don't see anybody else's hands go up, but if I could just really briefly though, I imagine that you're distributing the aid not on a per capita basis evenly, but that you are making those additional funding that's intended for students. The federal government has given you discretion to determine what methodology you would use to distribute it among students. If you want to just sort of explain that quickly, that would be helpful, I think.
Sure. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So our approach this most recent round has been consistent with our approach previously. So in May and June of 2020, we began distributing the CARES Act emergency grants to students based on a needs analysis. And so we went off of FAFSA submissions that we had in hand. We also had a late phase in that process that allowed students to file a FAFSA late should their financial circumstances have changed. And so we were offering students at that point in time about $800 in federal funding in terms of emergency grant. And again, as Scott mentioned before, those are funds that pass through directly to the student in the form of a check, basically to their bank account. We're using a similar approach this second time around, although with smaller award amounts. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to spread out the support over time a bit more for those students that have been coming to us with pretty severe financial constraints that they're facing as a result of the pandemic. So we're just simply trying to push this out over time. We're trying to create more space for students to ask for additional support should they need additional support. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach, still based on a needs analysis. The only other comment that I would make is that, as you know, we have an institutional aid application for undocumented students. We're not allowed to use the federal monies for our students who fill out those undocumented student aid applications, but we have, in many instances, made available to our undocumented students the same level of support as we're using the federal monies. We're doing so with the institutional funds, financial aid funds that we have available.
Thank you for that explanation. Are there any other questions about this point? If not, then Mr. Jordan, why don't you just continue on to the next question?
Sure. The second question was, please provide detail on mitigation efforts and also note any measures that have been reversed or halted, for example, furlough days or associated savings that won't happen because of reversals. In fiscal 21, the current fiscal year, the UConn projected a deficit of $76 million, largely as a result of COVID. We have, as I said earlier, we've received federal support to help offset that, but it hasn't been a 100% offset. We have cut $48 million of expense at the university during the current fiscal year. We've done a number of things. The first thing we did was we instituted a hiring freeze and a spending freeze. By that, we meant that any hiring, any new spending initiated by a department needed to be approved at the highest levels of the university, and we're very careful about that. Of course, important roles like public safety, your first responders, or folks in our healthcare system, we did fill slots as they came open. But as a result of our hiring freeze and spending freeze, we did save a substantial amount of money. Senior managers at UConn took 13 furlough days. That's a 5% pay cut this year. All managers took 7 furlough days, a 2.7% pay cut. We eliminated 5 academic programs, including freezing enrollment in adult learning. We eliminated library journal subscriptions. We eliminated Nutmeg Summer Theater. There's a list that we provide in our written answer, but it's a fairly long list of reduction in academic offerings. We've reduced admissions to 9 PhD programs. We eliminated 4 NCAA sports. We suspended extension services to adult learners. We halted the planned expansion of the Master's in Social Work program. The furlough program, I think the question did ask, is there anything that we've halted or reduced? The furlough program was initially slated to be a 24-day furlough for senior managers and a 12-day, pretty much 1 day a month or 2 days a month for all of management. As federal money was received, we did reduce that ask of our managers. So that is I think that was the question that was being asked. Have you halted any of these mitigation efforts? And I won't say we've halted, we've suspended for the time being, asking our managers to take additional pay cuts. But that is what we've done. The net result is that for fiscal 21, we started off with a $76 million deficit. We took $48 million of savings through cuts and reallocation of funds, leaving a $28 million deficit. We received $28 million, in fact, a little more than $28 million in federal aid in fiscal 21 to offset that, and we'll be carrying some federal aid into fiscal 22 to offset deficits in fiscal 22. It's important to note the federal fiscal year and the state fiscal year are different, so that we are not limited in our federal aid, so we are allowed to carry those funds into next fiscal year.
Would it be fair to say that a fair number of your fiscal year 21 cuts are? I'm not sure if this is what the second half of the question was getting into, how many have been suspended or halted. But a fair number of these are one-time expenses, and some of them are ongoing cuts, right? So the furlough days, obviously, as soon as you can match those to resources available. I imagine, the 4 NCAA sports that you've cut, that strikes me as a permanent cut.
Yes.
There are no plans to restore those sports. I'm curious about a couple of the others. Reduce admissions to 9 PhD programs. I presume that you had students willing or ready to enter into those programs. Is that the reason why how do you achieve savings by reducing admissions into a PhD program? And are those savings going to be sort of permanent moving forward?
Sure. PhD programs are very competitive, and when a student comes to UConn or any research university and enrolls in a PhD program, there's often a packaging of the program with that student that might provide the student with a teaching assistantship or a research assistantship that might allow them a tuition waiver or a stipend. We've all, a pretty substantial teaching load and research load is borne by our PhD students. So there's, when we are trimming our budget, one of the tools that deans and department heads have is to reduce the number of teaching assistantships and research assistantships that they offer, which makes it harder to attract PhD students. So the net result is that when the number of PhD slots we have available is largely limited by our budget in that year. That's not to say that in a more normal year that we may open some of those programs up. So that is best seen as a variable cost that that can be dialed up and down depending on our ability to pay. It's also very important to note that a university's academic reputation is driven in part by its graduate schools and the quality of its PhD programs, and that this is something that we want to be competitive in, and we would not see reduction of our graduate program as a permanent a thing we'd want to do permanently.
Right, and the master's, the delay in the expansion of the master's of social work program, that program's housed at your Hartford branch, I think.
Yes, it is.
Presumably that's a temporary delay, one that you will get back on schedule at some point.
Yeah, we would like to get that back on schedule at some point.
And I'm tempted to ask about the Nutmeg Summer Theater, but I might be the only one interested. So is there any other questions regarding their own mitigation efforts? Seeing none, we got 2 questions left. Why don't you?
Sure. Question number 3, provide FTE and employee count breakdowns by fund source. That we provided a table to you. I'll give you highlights. UConn has 2,258 employees, total salary of $206.5 million on the general fund. That is, those are positions that are funded out of the block grant. We have a total of 4,906 FTEs at UConn. So the block grant funded portion is about 45% of UConn employees are paid by state funds. The remaining employees are paid either by tuition, room and board, other fees, or revenue that we generate through business activities at the university, or through mostly federal research grants.
Any questions about that answer? If not, then we'll move on to the final question.
Question 4, provide projected FY21 personal service costs and total fringe costs expected to be funded by the general fund versus other sources. As I said in the answer to my previous question, the general fund, the block grant, $206.5 million of salary, $186.4 million of fringe costs, which, to our earlier discussion, is 186 million over 206. I can't do the math in my head, but I think that is an 80+% fringe cost, and that is driven by the unfunded pension liabilities, as we've discussed. All other funds at the university, tuition fees and research grants, total salaries $395.4 million, total fringe costs $153.7 million.
Are there any questions about that response? Since we're on that point, though, I think that you said that you might have another chart or 2 that would illuminate your fringe rate issue. I think I saw one in the deck that showed the actual fringe rate over time. We've again, as Senator Austin mentioned, we've really only recently gotten serious about paying off our unfunded liability, and as a result, those payments have been increasing for the entire duration of my time in the General Assembly. I think the last 12 years, it's consumed almost all of the budget growth. But there's a chart in here, I think, that talks about what the fringe rate is and has been over the last 20 years that members might be interested in to see. There it is.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see. I just tried to share it. I know other folks on this call know that I'm not to be trusted sharing.
But I do.
But I'm not a good sharer. I'm just not great with the computer while I'm talking.
No, and what's interesting about this chart, I think, and I'll let you expand on it a little bit more if you'd like, but like when I was a student at UConn about 10 years prior to the start of this chart in 1989, but very little, it's a very reasonable sort of fringe rate that you were charged in addition for the non-block granted students, non-block granted employees. Fringe rate of probably well below 20% in the late 80s, rising to about 19% in 1999, and now at 64%. And that's reflective of the state's actually has begun to pay off our debt. And so anything else that you wanted to sort of share, observations to make about this chart?
Yeah, I think this is an important chart, and Representative, you know the story at the state level better than most of us do, but you can see, if you recall from the last slide that we shared with you, that the unfunded pension liability portion of the fringe benefit rate that the comptroller charges the university is in fiscal 21 is 64%, and that's at the far right of this scale. And that back before the state began in earnest trying to pay off the unfunded pension liability, the fringe rate associated with our employees that were in the state retirement system was about 19%, which is pretty competitive for a retirement system. And you can see that as the state began, as I said, in earnest paying off this debt, somewhere around the mid part of the 2000s there, I'm going to say, in the period between 2011 and 2014 was when this happened. The fringe rate went up dramatically. But then the second piece to this, Representative, is what you were describing earlier, which is that this imperfect way of sharing the pension, unfunded pension liability cost with the universities, UConn Health, and CCSU, and our share of employment versus the state share of employment and the state total pension liability has caused that even as the state actuarially has gotten this under control somewhere around 2014, the cost to the university has gone up every year since, just about, with some starts and stops along the way. But the trend is that it will continue to go up for UConn even as the state has got the unfunded pension costs under control. So I think that's an important point that you made earlier.
And as I recall from your public hearing testimony, you had actually broken that down to what you think a fair estimate of the cost of this is now to students going to the university in terms of their fees.
Yeah, on this slide, I can show you that in the top portion here, we show by fiscal year starting in fiscal 20 and projecting out through fiscal 23, the actual cost of this unfunded pension liability or unfunded legacy cost and how we pay for it. So we do know that there is, for any employee at UConn or UConn Health that is paid from the block grant, which is the, earlier what I described, about 45% of our payroll, we are treated just like any other state agency, and the state comptroller through appropriations to the comptroller's office pays for those fringe costs. For those employees that are paid out of university resources, tuition fees and research grants at stores principally, and clinical revenue and research grants at UConn Health, that at stores in fiscal 20, I'll just read the first column to you. Our estimate is that tuition fees and research grants are paying $38 million to the state pension fund against these unfunded liabilities. And that at UConn Health, 51.6 million is being paid. We acknowledge that in fiscal 20, UConn Health received $33 million from an additional appropriation from the state to offset that. So the net cost to UConn Health's clinical and research operations was $18 million in fiscal 20. In fiscal 21, we're projecting $34 million at stores in the regional campuses and $53.8 million at UConn Health. That's a total of $88 million of cost at UConn that is charged to the university that goes back into the state's retirement system. When we think of that top line, as you said, Representative, how much is is being charged to our students. The $27.4 million is being charged to our tuition fees and other funds that we receive from students and families. And just kind of rough math based on our enrollment, which is about 30,000 students at UConn. That's almost $1,000 per student in tuition and fees that is going to the state pension program.
Thank you for sharing those costs. Are there any questions? You can stop sharing your screen, and that way I'll be able to see my participant list. We're just about 9 minutes before the conclusion of our allocated time. Are there any other questions that people have for UConn about those answers to those questions, or anything else that people might be on people's mind? You have a whole 9 minutes, and I guess we're going to get outside and try to walk around the block, as we were talking about earlier. Thank you very much for your answers. We appreciate it. I think our subcommittee has a meeting to discuss our ideas about things that might be included, or we might suggest to the chairs of the committee to be putting into our budget recommendations. That meeting is scheduled for us tomorrow. But we appreciate your time with us today. And if I don't see anybody else raise their hand, then we'll just say thank you, and we will. I think we'll be adjourned. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.